Welcome back in. I'm Collete Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camerata. Steve is the author of Late Talking Children, A Symptom or a Stage. The book is now in its second edition. And in the book, you talk about challenges for parents that they might face with their late talking child, specifically navigating the school system. So today, Steve's going to provide some helpful tips for parents on that topic. And we've talked a lot about those early school days in previous episodes, but let's focus on what comes after that.
Yeah, so there's initial kind of getting the child acclimated to school, having them fit in. There's often bumps in the road and challenges, and then things kind of settle in. But that doesn't mean that there's not late talker traits and challenges that'll come up later on in school as well.
Yeah, you talk about the characteristics, their behaviors that they carry with them. Can you kind of touch upon those again to remind people what those are?
So late talking children tend to learn visually more than auditory. They also tend to be very interested in the topics that they like and less interested in topics they don't like. We're all that way a little bit, but late talkers are more so. And so often if there's a subject they're not interested in, it's kind of hard to motivate them. And then also the idea that they learn better, that late talkers generally learn better by watching and doing hands-on things rather than listening to others, still creates challenges in the regular education setting because a lot of that is lectures, listen to the teacher, and things like that, which works great for most children, but isn't as optimal for late talking children.
You also write that late talking children tend to do well in high school and college. Can you elaborate more on that?
What happens in late middle school and then in high school and college is more of the learning gets turned over to the student. So if you think about preschool and elementary school, it's really designed to teach children to kind of conform to an educational model that's primarily reading-based, listening-based, and so on. But when a child gets into high school and college, they have a lot more freedom to learn in their own way. Like in my case, where I have difficulty listening, I have a little bit of a challenge with auditory working memory. And when I got to high school and college, I learned that if I preview the material before a lecture, I could just do a lot better. And so we didn't really have PowerPoints that a long time ago. The internet wasn't invented. But I could look ahead in the syllabus, the course outline, and then read ahead of time. And when I did that, I got more out of the lectures. And then for things like math and I remember chemistry, organic chemistry, if I could see the molecule carbon chains and I could really understand them and how they were named, and if I listened to the professor, he was actually an Irish guy, he had a thick Irish accent, which made it a little harder. I couldn't really understand the nomenclature for organic chemistry, but when I could see the molecules and visualize them, then it really made sense to me.
I still can't.
Well, no, everybody has different things. Organic chemistry actually is interesting because it's like calculus. People kind of get it or they don't. So, and yeah, that's not meant to be anything negative to people who don't do well with that. Same thing with geometry. I would build little figures and look at them and touch them, build little pyramids and so on. And by doing that, it helped me to understand the material that was being presented in class. And so it wasn't like someone sat me down like in grade school and I had to listen to what the teacher said to try and learn that. I could learn it in my own way, and that was just a huge advantage. And that's what happens with late talkers generally. I mean, it's true for a lot of different students, but for late talkers, it really helps a lot.
I mean, what you're describing to me just sounds like a very hands-on education
Hands-on,
approach.
That's a great phrase. Hands-on is the best way for late talkers to learn.
What's the difference between teaching content and teaching compliance, and why is that challenging for late talkers?
Well, late talkers in general tend not to be compliant, and my department chair and my colleagues would say that I'm not completely compliant in my work. I do things in my own way. I love people, and I always want to be supportive and part of a team, but I also do things in my own way. So a lot of early education in particular is designed to get children to line up, to sit in chairs, to do things at the same time, to transition on the clock and things like that. And late talkers really, when we get interested in something, we want to keep doing it until we master it. And so if you're saying, okay, we're going to read a story and we're going to read this part of Charlotte's Web or whatever it is, and then we're going to transition to something else, the late talker may want to keep reading Charlotte's Web because they're interested in it, or if they're doing some math problem, they may want to understand the proportion or the percentages or whatever it is. And so this idea of like kind of herding children to do things, and you have to do that. I mean, otherwise it would be chaos. I'm not saying we can't do that. It's just that late talkers don't do very well. And so when you're looking at when you're dealing with schools, and let's say a note comes home or something, as a parent, you want to think about, is this a problem with my child's learning because our goal is to get knowledge into the long-term memory, or is this that my child isn't really learning the same way as other children? And it's because that learning style may suit other children, but not my child, and so you want to judge that. One of the stories I like to tell is a late talker that we worked with him when he was in preschool, but then he was in third grade. And the parents called me up in a panic because the school had said he has behavior challenges. Now, some late talkers do have behavior challenges, so it can happen. But in this case, the child really wasn't someone who was a behavior challenge. And it turned out that they were trying to get him to do math that he already knew. And he just wasn't going to do the worksheets that he already knew. He didn't see the point in it. And so he would tear up the papers and just not comply. And so I said to the teacher, I said, "Oh, just let him work ahead. Don't have him. He already knows these. He's learned these several years ago. He already knows how to do percentages and fractions and things like that. So just let him work ahead." And they said, "Oh, we can't do that." And so the behavior report was based on compliance. He could do math, and in fact, he graduated summa cum laude with an engineering degree from Georgia Tech. So he was really good in math, and now makes his living doing math-related work. But back then, the problem wasn't that he couldn't learn math. The problem was he wouldn't learn math in the way that they were trying to force him to learn. And that's what I'm talking about.
Well, and that kind of leads into my next topic here, is that you suggest that parents ask whether knowledge is the main learning goal, or if compliance is the main learning goal. So parents should, how to approach that with the schools.
Yeah, so let's say that a child is asked to do worksheets, which is, I'm generally not completely on board with worksheets. I think they don't induce deep learning. It's better to do fewer repetitive work that's more analytical. But anyway, when a child does worksheets, if they show knowledge, so a lot of times worksheets will have multiple replications of the same concept over and over again. And so you can say, okay, here's this worksheet. Does the child know how to do whatever's on there? Is it, if they can multiply, divide, whatever it is, do they know their history facts or whatever it is? And once you do that, then it's like, well, why are you making them do more of these worksheets when they already are showing you the knowledge? Okay, and so you want to think about, you always want to be engaged with the teachers and ask them, what do you expect my child to know? So you can focus on that and try to run interference a little bit and be a catalyst for making sure the child has the knowledge, while also making sure that they just don't keep having them do repetitive work over and over again that just is really tedious. I would say that for all children, but because late talkers tend not to be compliant anyway, it can be a bit of a challenge.
Explain what teaching at grade level means and how that might not work for a lot of late talkers.
Yeah, so I'm not going to go into depth, but there was an education policy worker who went into a Ford factory where they were assembling cars. And prior to that in the U.S., education was very individualized. So when you went into a classroom, it wasn't based on your age level, it's based on your skill level. So if people read the Little House on the Prairie books, for example, Laura Ingalls was working ahead, but she was able to work ahead. And some of the boys that she wrote about were older boys, but still, on elementary subjects. There's an old TV show called The Beverly Hillbillies, and Jethro, who's kind of a caricature, said that the second grade was the happiest 3 years of his life. And so there was an idea that when you had a grade level, that you had to learn everything that a second grader was expected to learn, no matter how old you were, in order to go to the third grade. So it was competency-based, knowledge-based. But what's happened recently over the last really half century is that it doesn't matter whether you have that knowledge or not, you get passed based on age, okay? And so basically what's happening is that when you go into a classroom, say in the second grade, they're teaching everybody the same at the same age, but there's a lot of variation in the children's skill level. And so that's really going to be a problem unless you're right at the middle of that distribution the middle of the knowledge for a second grader or whatever it is at that age. Then you're either going to be teaching stuff that's too advanced, or behind like it was for that child I mentioned with third grade math, where he was really ahead. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. So they're just teaching children in there, and they're not really thinking about what their skill level is. And that's really just a tragic article came out about last month where literally in some schools, 0% of the students were competent in math in fourth grade. Oh, my goodness. I guess I'm talking too long.
There was just a little noise in the
That's
studio.
fine. Yeah,
Don't worry,
folks.
folks. Yeah. So they were teaching, you said an article about a month ago came out, and that the competency level of math.
Yeah, the competency level, there was literally no students in the entire school who were competent in math. And this isn't just one school. This is multiple schools in multiple cities. Now, part of it's COVID related and distance learning, but part of it is that if you think about math or you think about reading, it's really important that you have basic skills to keep building. And if you just pass students without them having the knowledge, then you're going to be adding more and more advanced things, and they don't even have the basics, so they're just going to end up not learning anything. And so that's what's happening, where we're just moving kids through based on age and not on ability level, and that's really a problem. And for late talkers, it's a huge problem, because most late talkers are going to be a little bit behind in terms of listening, and they're going to be a little bit or a lot ahead in terms of math and science. And so that day that they're in school, very little of the material is going to be at their skill level. So they might need a little more time with reading. About half the late talkers are either at or above grade level in reading, and I was above grade level. About half are below grade level. My son Vincent, it took him a long time to read, and so we had to be patient with him. He struggled with reading. And so if you think about a regular reading class, most of them are either going to be way ahead or way behind. And so the material that's in there isn't going to match their needs.
But a lot of schools have specialists, right? And is that they're designed to help those kids?
So specialists are really good, and my son Vincent had great specialists. I remember one in particular in primary grades was just really fantastic. So a specialist can be really good, but a specialist could also, if they're just simply doing the same things in the classroom over and over again to a greater extent, can actually be a bit of a problem. So one of the things I do as a professor is I teach master's students how to be speech pathologists, and we were doing a reading clinic for children with language problems, middle school children. And this is also a behavior disorder situation. So the child was in a resource room. The child could, it was a girl, a young school-age girl. She could sound out words really well, but she didn't understand what she read. And so the specialist was focusing and making her drill on sounding out words, which she already could do really well. And so she wasn't really compliant with that. And it was really interesting because the regular education teacher and the parents had this child as very compliant, and she was. But the tutor, the reading specialist, really had her being referred for behavior problems, and it was because she already knew how to do what that specialist was teaching, and the specialist didn't know or have other tools in her toolkit to help her learn to read with comprehension. And so it's like early intervention. It's important and it's good, but if it's the wrong kind, it's bad.
How can the difference between learning through listening and learning through reading impact a late talker's education?
So one of my favorite vignettes for that is when my son was in high school, the history teacher he had as a sophomore was just this really, really nice guy and a friend. I still see him in the neighborhood. And he said to me, he took me aside one day and he said, your son really is not making his best effort. And this late talking son is, really idealistic. And a lot of late talkers are idealistic, and he always really tries hard. In fact, I remember when he was in grade school and some kids were kind of they were kind of goofing off. He said to me, "Dad, they're not responsible learners." And so I knew that this wasn't the case. So I asked the teacher, I said, why do you think that? And he said, well, in the classroom quizzes, he doesn't do well. He fails them. And then on the exams, he does really well. I said, well, tell me a little bit more. And he said, well, the in-class quizzes are based on the lectures, and the exams are based on the readings. And so this was a history class, so when he could read the material, by that time he was a good reader, then he could remember it. But when he was in the classroom listening, he couldn't process that. And he literally was failing the quizzes. And This is also a good example. This is a great teacher, fantastic. My other children had him, and just can't say enough positive about him. When the late talker was learning differently, he didn't really have insight into this idea of reading versus listening, because for most students it doesn't matter. And so then he went to other reasons, which is that, he's just goofing off, and then he studies hard for the exam, which is what his theory was about how my son was performing. And to his credit, once he knew that, he actually went to a lot of work to give my son the notes and stuff ahead of time, which is, of course, what I had to do. So in a sense, my son was walking in my own footsteps. But it's really important that we use visual supports with late talkers always.
Talking about your son and, someone potentially thinking he had a behavior problem, that happens a lot, right? You've seen a lot of educators try and label kids with ADHD, for example, when in fact they don't have a medical diagnosis for that, but someone's trying to pin that on them, right?
Yeah, so again, we talked a little bit about compliance versus content knowledge. And so there's this idea that a child has to sit still and listen in order to learn. And late talkers are not sit still and listen kind of people. And since they don't really do well with that, then what happens is, again, teachers are great, and they're trying to meet the children where they are, and they're trying to teach them. But when the normal things they do don't work, then they go to disabilities or things like ADHD or other problems, and they then kind of push that. And I do want to make a point that if a teacher comes and says, hey, your child has ADHD, don't necessarily take that at face value. Sometimes late talkers do have ADHD. I don't want to say they don't. But that's something that should be evaluated by a medical professional, and the teacher shouldn't push it. Again, using my own late talker as an example, in second grade, teacher said, hey, I really think your child has ADHD. And I said, okay, well, tell me why you think that. And she said, well, when I'm reading stories, he won't sit still. He moves around and so on. And then I said to her, well, are there times when he does sit still? And she said, oh, yeah, when he's doing math, or he loves art. He's a gifted artist. Or when he's doing art, he'll sit there, no problem. And I said, well, let's think about that, And to her credit, she was able to think through that what she thought was ADHD was that he just couldn't sit still and listen. And the example I like to use is, and which helped with her, I said, okay, let's say that you're in a classroom and someone's reading fairy tales, Grimm's fairy tales, macabre set of tales, and maybe not a good thing to read in terms of content. But if they're reading them in German, I bet you wouldn't sit still either. I think, your attention would wander. And really for a lot of late talkers, it is literally like they're learning English as a second language. And so they don't necessarily understand what's going on. And so their attention is going to waver, and they're not necessarily going to sit still.
So how should a parent make sure they get their child a proper diagnosis if that's something that's been discussed?
So what a parent, so let's say that the school says, hey, I think your child has ADHD. And again, I just want to be careful. A lot of schools are really good, but other schools really push this, and they'll push medication. 1 in 8 boys are being medicated in this country for ADHD. In Scandinavia, which has higher achievement scores, it's about 1 in 600. So is there something about Americans that gives them more of a likelihood of having ADHD? Or is it that our education system maybe is a mismatch, particularly for boys in terms of how they learn, and certainly for late talkers? So we want to think about that. Anyway, you want to go to first your family physician or your pediatrician, discuss it, and then if it's warranted, have an evaluation by a developmental pediatrician, and be sure you're engaging with that developmental pediatrician to say, look, my child's a late talker. Maybe they have some language listening problems. We want to have them evaluated for ADHD, but, we'd really like to have a differential diagnosis here. Is it ADHD, or is it that when there's a high listening load, they don't pay attention? And that differential is very important.
Yeah, you wrote that to make sure it's not judged solely based on what they're doing in the classroom.
Yeah, the classroom is only one context, and you're really looking for other situations. And really, actually, I'm going to defer to my colleagues who are medically trained, but broadly speaking, when a child can sit and focus on something for long periods of time without moving, and they can attend, that's an interesting piece of evidence that you want to communicate to the physician. Usually with ADHD, and I do see it a lot, when a child is engaged in a preferred activity, they have an impulse to move. So they're working on something, and then they have to get up, move, come back, move, come back. And then for the attention part of it, if there's a distractor that happens, they're really focused on something they're interested in, and then you move something on the periphery, they can't inhibit that. They have to attend to it. And so, that, again, a skilled physician can totally make the diagnosis or rule it out.
You listed some tips for parents looking at school. So I'm going to read the tips, and if you could just kind of expand on each one of those as we go through. So first of all, you said find a school with the least emphasis on teaching by listening. And this is specific to late talkers.
Yeah, so a lot of schools, and again, they can come in different forms, but some schools like Montessori schools, Waldorf schools, and so on, by definition, they're activity-based, they're materials-based, and so they're less of an emphasis on sit still and listen. They're more of an emphasis on materials and instruction in that way. And so the idea is that if you go into a classroom and you visit the classroom and it's relatively quiet and the children are engaged in different activities, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for something that's low verbal, where the children are learning by doing, and that there's essentially graded types of things that that build knowledge without having to have a lot of lecture. Now, again, I'm not saying you can't talk to the late talker and they can't learn that way. Of course, late talkers can, but it's better if the relative proportion is more learn by doing as opposed to learn by listening.
I mean, and the whole goal is to set your child up for success. So if that seems to be the most successful environment, right?
What's important, really? So one of the things that happens is that we do things by grades, and we have grade level benchmarks, and people really focus on that in the short term. So a school district might say, a second grader should know X, Y, and Z, and those are important things to know. But a lot of times they'll push the panic button. But a lot of times late talkers are going to do that in their own time, and they may need more. They may just need more time. And so what you want to do is think about, okay, what do I want my child to know when they're, an adolescent, when they're going to go to college or go into a trade or whatever it is they're going to do? What do they need to know in order to be an informed adult? And so you just really winnow the information and make sure of that. And in my own opinion, you want to know math, you want to know science, you want to know history, you want to be able to read and comprehend what you read. And if you can do those things, then you're gonna have the tools you need to be successful down the line. And so it should really focus on that, and the focus is on patience, not necessarily an assembly line where we're trying to put little bits of knowledge on kids as they move through an assembly line. That's just not really how it works.
Well, that's your second tip. Best if school does not expect all children to be learning at grade level.
Right. So some children, as I mentioned before, can be working ahead if their skill level allows it. Others may need more time. And it's not uncommon at all for a late talker to be, let's say a fourth grade late talker. They may be at the second grade level in some subjects, and they may be at the seventh or eighth grade level in other subjects. And so we want to make sure the school is flexible and allows that kind of a model.
And number 3, a flexible teacher, one who is willing to adjust their style to the student's needs.
The most important thing is that a teacher has to have a belief in the child and their ability to learn. Most teachers are fantastic. They're good. They're intuitive. They love the children and they're supportive. Some teachers have kind of a my way or the highway attitude, and that's an invitation for a late talker to be non-compliant. And so the idea here is that you really want a teacher that is willing to meet the child where they are, and that's important. Another thing, too, is that when teachers are teaching and the child doesn't learn quite in the same way, the first thing they're going to do is think, well, what kind of disability, like that history teacher, in his case, he was thinking about the motivation for my son. But then, if you have a speech pathologist or somebody who can work with the teacher, they can help them understand that it's not about ADHD, unless it is, of course. It's not about motivation. It's actually about the learning style. And then once that teacher's been reassured, I can just tell you that then they actually can engage their teaching skills to help that child once their worries are reduced.
Your 4th tip is the goal of teaching is content.
So again, we want to build an adult brain. That's our goal. And we want to understand that there's different ways of doing that. And so we have a clear focus on this is what an educated adult knows. Now, we're going to start in preschool and we're going to start building that. And we're going to do it in a systematic, in a patient way, so that, it's like when they get to be 18 or 19, they're going to have this. One of my favorite things to say is one of the things that happens is that because of preschools and so on, children have to be potty trained at the age of 3. Well, late talkers on average don't get potty trained until they're 4. So parents are like really worried about this, and they get into test of wills because, again, non-compliance. And so I always say to the parents, I promise you they'll be potty trained by the time they're 18. I can promise you that. So if they don't make it till they're about 4, not a big deal really, but because of school, they're trying to accelerate things in some ways. And most kids are potty trained by then. It's just late talkers have their own clock for that.
That's right.
On average, right? Exactly.
Number 5, can you get access to the information ahead of time so you can help introduce the topics ahead of time to your child? You said that was something that was successful for you.
So one of the great things about the internet and email, although there are times when I wish I didn't have to answer so many emails, although I love getting emails from families and I always try to answer those. There's a lot of communication between the teachers and the parents if they can access it. And so in the ideal world, what will happen is that at the beginning of the school year, there'll be either a general class notice or the parent can ask for it of what skills the goals are for that year and benchmarks. And then week to week, if the teacher can give a lesson plan or an idea of what's going to be taught, particularly the vocabulary, so the parents can kind of preview it for the late talker, that's going to be hugely beneficial. And so knowing what's coming ahead in terms of content and then priming or previewing it for the late talker is extremely valuable. Again, we want to be mindful. The teachers work so hard. On the other hand, they're kind of doing this anyways to prepare for their classes, so if they're willing to share that information, it can be extremely helpful.
Your final tip on this topic, take the long view.
We're building an adult brain. And so it's just you get these notes home. Sadly, sometimes schools will say to parents, hey, this isn't a good match for you, so that the child isn't allowed to go to a school the parents want and things like that. And that can just be really heartbreaking. And so we want to think about this, game plan. And I can only imagine what my own parents must have thought, when I had bumps in the road in grade school and so on. Again, I wasn't the most compliant student. One of my colleagues said that if I were in today's world, that I would have been really highly medicated for ADHD. Thankfully, it wasn't quite that way back then. But the point is that we want to think about what is the child going to be as an adult. And I've been working with late talkers long enough that I have letters and emails from parents that are their children in their 20s or even into their 30s now, and they talk about what a great adult their child is. And even when the late talking is a symptom of something else, and there's more long-term types of things, it's still just an amazingly positive journey if the parents will embrace the journey and take the long view and not be panicking year to year. I have families that the teachers will say, well, he has to know fractions in third grade. And so they just drill fractions before the child's ready to learn them. And that just makes the learning of math aversive for the child, and they don't like math. But if you're just a little more patient and you take the long view, maybe they would really enjoy it. And so we want to think about what they need to know today and how that fits in with taking the long view and building an adult brain.
Well, like one of the things you wrote finally in that chapter, a final thought in that chapter was talking came late, so other things might come late too.
Exactly, especially things that are language related, like reading can in some cases. But yeah, we just need to be patient, and we just need to be say, okay, in this moment, at this time, this is what my child is ready to learn, and down the line, we'll learn these other things, but my child isn't learning in this according to the same schedule as the other children. This is what they need to learn in this moment, or my child's ready to move ahead. So we're going to keep moving it ahead and allow them to learn more quickly. And so it's really a matter of meeting the children where they are. That's taking that developmental perspective is so crucial. And by the way, I would say that that's one of the reasons that we see such challenges in our schools where they're not doing that, and where we have schools where literally no children are at grade level or competent in math or reading or basic skills because they're just moving everybody ahead too quickly.
Steve, we're getting close to the end of the book. We've got one chapter coming up in our next podcast, the last chapter. We're going to explore that. It's kind of a recap and your final thoughts on that. So tune in for that next week. In the meantime, please feel free to ask us a question. Just drop it in the comments section below. Click subscribe so you don't miss a thing and hit that bell. And you can always check out the Late Talkers Foundation website.
And always remember, the best thing for your child is you.